Okay, so in this lecture what we want to talk about is methods in Old Testament theology, and this will roughly correspond, again, to Hossel. We're going to talk about some other things here that are not in your book, but that are still relevant to this discussion. So to begin, we want to look at the different types of methods that are used in Old Testament theology. And again, if you remember from the first lecture, I want you to keep this distinction in your mind between historical description and theological prescription, because that is going to come into play again and again in distinguishing these methods in Old Testament theology. So this is exactly where we start. Historical description, what it meant versus what it means. We've already discussed Christopher Stendahl. We've discussed this distinction. We've discussed the history of religion school. The other piece that we want to discuss here is the traditio-historical approach, most prominently used by Gerhard von Rad. Von Rad thought that, unlike history of religions, which, well, I mean, like history of religions, but a little bit different. History of religions is looking at the development of particular religious doctrines over time using documents. Okay, so what they're trying to do is look at documents and see how this developed. Von Rad actually wants to get behind the documents, even so another step further back, to the development of tradition. Not necessarily documented. I mean, we see evidence of it in documents, but we're trying to get even behind documentation to just tradition. So oral tradition would be an example. How are beliefs passed down, and then when do we see them arise in the documentation? And so in each of these approaches, under this one approach called historical description, what you're trying to do is get behind the text to see the historical background of it, whatever text or section of text you might be looking at, and understand how it developed, what the situation was at the time, and then with Von Rad, even further back, the traditions behind that text and how those traditions developed. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to situate the text in a historical location and understand the text through that historical lens. Again, it's just description. There is no prescription here. It is just, this is what this text said and what it meant at the time. Next we have dogmatic didactic approach. Here, the systematic loci, so God, man, salvation, and then, I mean, we could keep going, church, eschatology, those sort of things. Those are the organizing principles of Old Testament theology. So instead of organizing it around different sections of text or different traditions behind the text, you're organizing Old Testament theology around systematic categories. G.L. Bauer and Denton are the predominant figures in this approach, and what they're trying to do is say, all right, let's collect the data, kind of like we talked about with systematic. Let's collect the data and see what these Old Testament books say about these particular doctrines. I don't want to give the impression that they leave the historical descriptive piece behind. They don't. They're still concerned with what those texts meant at the time. They're still concerned with what Israelites believed at the time. Nevertheless, instead of organizing it around source material, they're organizing it using systematic categories. Next is the genetic progressive approach. From a conservative standpoint, if you go read G.K. Beale's New Testament Biblical Theology, he identifies his approach with this model, genetic progressive, and he actually uses those terms. It's sometimes called the history of redemption. It usually follows the Old Testament covenants as its organizing principle, so you move from covenant to covenant to covenant, from Adam to Noah to Abraham to Moses to David to the New Covenant. And in this model, you know, especially in a conservative approach like Beale's or his predecessors Gaffin and Voss, what you see is sort of what's meant by genetic is an organic growth. So in other words, what you see with Adam is a seed, and that seed flowers into the rest of the Old Testament material. And so you can connect the dots using the covenants as a guide, but seeing everything is connected and flowering from that one starting point in Adam, his pre-fall covenant, the fall, and then the covenant of redemption. The cross-section method, on the other hand, is trying to find structural unity. Eichrodt, again, finds this in covenants. But the difference between this and genetic progressive is that Eichrodt is still trying to do this on purely historical terms, whereas the genetic progressive sees the Old Testament material as a theological unity, that you just start here and you progress through this line and you end here with the New Covenant. Eichrodt, on the other hand, wants to take each piece and still situate it historically. So Eichrodt is trying to, in the cross-section view, which Eichrodt is the predominant proponent of, is trying to still use the covenants as a structural unity, but instead of looking at the covenants sort of post ad hoc, he's looking at them in each piece historically and descriptively and tying them together. Von Rad wants to look at them diachronically, that is, he wants to see the progression. Remember we talked about him being traditional historical. He wants to see how things progress, how they grow, how and not just progress and grow, but how they develop over time and maybe even change over time. Eichrodt, on the other hand, is trying to look at it all together as one picture and say, we want to see how these things fit together now that they're all here. Again, this isn't the same as genetic progressive, because genetic progressive, while it still looks at it synchronically as a unit, it's not as interested in purely historical description. Eichrodt, on the other hand, is. It's a fine line between these two, as you can tell. What I want to say to distinguish them for you is that Eichrodt really focuses on the historical descriptive piece, whereas the genetic progressive model focuses more on the prescription, the theological unity of those covenants. Next is topical, and again, this is pretty self-explanatory, I think. I'm talking about a topic. So you organize Old Testament theology around topics. You can either use a center, so maybe you pick the glory of God as your centering theme in Old Testament theology. And each book, you walk through what that book says about the glory of God. Jim Hamilton's book, The Glory of God in Salvation Through Judgment, is an example of this, where he looks for a centering theme and then traces it through individual books. In more classic Old Testament theology, J.L. Mackenzie and Zimmerly are the examples here. It can either be a center or a diversity of themes. So, for instance, Brevard Childs, he in his Old Testament theology, he has lots of different themes that he uses to organize his Old Testament theology, and then looks at what the whole canon says about those themes. So you could talk about family, you could talk about monotheism, you could talk about idolatry. I mean, all of these themes, topics, can be used as organizing principles. Then you have the diachronic or formation of tradition methods. With diachronic, you trace the development of the material over time, and again, that material can change. This is Von Rad. Von Rad, in this diachronic model, this is where you would find instances, like we've talked about on the history of religions, this development over time of a doctrine where it actually shifts from something like polytheism to something like monotheism. A similar method would be the formation of traditions. Peter Stuhlmacher is an example here. It's building on von Rad, it's building on the traditio-historical approach, but instead of just tracing the development, it's also at the same time looking for a centering of the tradition. So in other words, not just how do these things develop, but why and around what center do they develop. So with von Rad, you're just sort of tracing things. With the formation of traditions method, you're tracing them still. You're tracing the development. They can change over time. Beliefs can change over time. What the Old Testament says can change over time. But you're trying to find out what is the center of that changing tradition. And then there's the thematic dialectic approach. Walter Brueggemann is the classic example here. And what you're doing in this approach is looking for tension in the biblical material and how it develops. This is again related to Hegel, the Hegelian dialectic. You know, this conversation and many times tension and even argument between material. So, for instance, you have lament versus blessing. You know, lament saying, God, you have forsaken us, versus blessing saying, God, you remember us. How are those things in tension? And in that tension, what arises from it? What doctrine arises? What material arises from that tension? So sometimes the tension is resolved. Other times the tension just stays there. And Brueggemann is the famous proponent of this approach. And he sees no problem in seeing tension in the biblical material. And the point of tension is to put us in tension and to respond to it. And then you have recent critical approaches, John J. Collins and James Barr. And basically, critical means critical. They're being very critical of any attempt to actually systematize biblical theology, to see unity in biblical theology. They don't want to see dogmatic concerns, in other words, doctrinal concerns in biblical theology. They want to return to basically a purely Gablerian approach, where all you're doing is describing what's there using historical critical methods. You're not trying to synthesize, you're not trying to prescribe, you are just focused on the historical description of the text, and that's it. And then finally, finally we have Brevard Childs with the final form. And we've talked about this a little bit, but Childs wants to acknowledge people like Wellhausen, people, we haven't discussed Martin Noth yet, but Martin Noth, Childs wants to acknowledge people even like von Rad, who see development, who see source material, but what he says is your focus shouldn't be on trying to chop up the text into different sources. Your focus shouldn't be on trying to chop it up and then understand each source individually. Your focus needs to be on the final form of the text as we have it now. We don't have these source materials. We have the final form. And so what we need to do when articulating biblical theology is focus on that final form, not on the sources, not on, and Childs would say we still are trying to be historically descriptive. So he would still say we're trying to describe the situation in which this final form came together. But he doesn't then go and try to chop up the text into sources and find their historical moment. It's just the final form of the text. So, for instance, with the Pentateuch, Childs might say, okay, the Pentateuch is divided up into different sources. But our focus isn't try to distinguish those sources so that we can then study them individually. Our focus is on seeing how those sources fit together and make one coherent book. That's what Childs brings to the table. Now, I should add that this PowerPoint is based off of Hazel's organization of material, we should add here that there is another strain of Old Testament theology that is again related to Gerhardus Voss. Your textbook, the Paul House book, is I would call him in the vein of Gerhardus Voss, and also Stephen Dempster. Both of your other textbooks are in this sort of conservative evangelical Old Testament theology vein. That's not a slide that's on here, and it's not something that Hazel really discusses. But it's important to note because what Dempster and House do is they pay attention to insights that we've seen here. They pay attention to Child's point, that we pay attention to the final form of the text. They pay attention to what we'll talk about next week about the canon and the order of the material and how that's important in Dempster. They talk about things like understanding books in their historical context. But what conservative evangelical theologians do is they don't at the same time accept the critical conclusions about the Old Testament books. So they wouldn't acknowledge that Moses didn't write some or most of the Pentateuch. They don't say that the Pentateuch wasn't finished until the 6th century. They don't say that Isaiah is 3 different books. Instead, they take the best of what Old Testament theologians have said, mainly regarding final form, the importance of historical context, the importance of the order of the material, and reject those things that are wrong, namely the historical critical conclusions about them. And so it's important to know that evangelical scholars can take the best of Old Testament theology and reject the worst of it. So let's take a pause moment here, and I want you to think about these different methods that we've discussed, and what are the best things that you could take from each of these. Now, there may not be something good to take from some of them, but what are the best things that you can take from each of these methods? Okay, now let's discuss some of the issues in biblical theology and more narrowly Old Testament theology. A lot of these we've discussed. Some of this is going to sound very familiar, particularly this one. We'll skim through that. Let's start with the New Testament use of the Old Testament. In biblical theology, if we say biblical theology includes both Old Testament theology and New Testament theology together, one of the big issues is the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. So, in other words, does the New Testament get it right when it uses Old Testament text? Now, this isn't our focus in this class because it's neither a biblical theology class or a New Testament theology class. Nevertheless, it is important because when we talk about Old Testament theology, many Old Testament theologians want to talk about the Old Testament as a discrete witness. This is Child's term. And they want to make sure that the Old Testament is read discreetly. In other words, in its own voice. Now, the point here is that in Christian interpretation, there is a strain of Marcionism where the Old Testament is no longer important and it's just the New Testament we need to pay attention to. So on the one hand, I understand this concern. On the other hand, we don't have just the Old Testament. We have the whole Bible. The Bible is one book. And so to say we need to read the Old Testament as a discrete witness, I'm not sure hits that truth completely. It is important to read the Old Testament and the Old Testament books as their own works. But we never lose sight of how the Old Testament ends, which is with the New Testament. And so this is a big issue in biblical theology. It's a big issue in both Testaments. We're not going to deal a whole lot with it in this class, other than for me to say here, I think it's important for us to understand the Old Testament text, but also to think about how it finds its fulfillment in the New Testament. So we'll leave it at that for now, and we'll discuss that more as we get into the actual Old Testament material. Second issue is descriptive versus prescriptive. I feel like I beat this to death, so I'm not going to focus on it. Yeah, we've already dealt with that. Third, unity and diversity. In other words, is the Old Testament unified in what it says, or is it diverse in the sense that it contradicts? There's some related issues here as far as the canon. Is the canon closed? So is this unity arbitrary in that it's only unified because the canon unifies it by putting it together? Or is the canon open? Could we still add stuff to the canon? Do we need to include the Old Testament pseudepigrapha and apocrypha in the discussions of Old Testament theology? And then, like I said, there is the issue of unity and diversity with subject matter. So is it unified? Does it have a coherent message, or is it contradictory? And then also there is the issue of the center of biblical theology. Is there a center? Is there a centering theme? As I said, Jim Hamilton, famously, maybe not famously, but within evangelical circles, famously has, God's glory and salvation through judgment. There are some who would say that's not even a centering theme because it's so big. And the problem becomes, wait a minute, how is that a center if it's too broad to say anything? On the other hand, if you pick something specific like temple, somebody would say, well, wait a minute, that's too narrow to include all the other themes that we see in the Old Testament. So some people don't like the theme approach, some people do, and then other people want to say that the center of Old Testament theology is the narrative that we see. So instead of going for the theme approach, the narrative approach instead says we don't want to pick a theme, but we do want to say that the story of the Old Testament actually centers it. And this is, again, G.K. Beale takes this approach. To some extent, Dempster does. And then you have sort of a mix of these. You have something like Tom Schreiner's biblical theology, where it's the king and his beauty. So you have God, his people, and the land, and he traces those three themes through the narrative. So you have three different themes traced through a narrative. So you have sort of a combination of the center approaches. So what I want you to think about as we finish here is how you would organize Old Testament theology. In both the methods and the issues, we've discussed a lot of stuff about organization. So as we finish this lecture, I want you to think about how would you organize? Would it be genetic progressive? Would it be center? Would it be narrative? Do you find any value in traditio-historical approaches? What would you do to organize Old Testament theology? So think about that as we finish up here.